When Morrison went to Paris, the last thing he said to the Doors was, "I'll write poetry, I'll rest, I'll come back." But what he recorded in that small Marais studio was something three men would never forget. By the time the tapes reached Los Angeles, Jim Morrison was already dead, and Ray Manzarek wished he had never heard those recordings. Studio owner Hervé Muller confessed in 2003. Morrison was crying while making those recordings, constantly begging that the tapes never be played for anyone, that only the Doors should hear them. When the Doors finally heard them, they swore never to release those recordings again, because in those tapes, Morrison's voice had the tone of someone who no longer wanted to live. When the door of the studio in the Marais district opened, Hervé Muller couldn't believe the man standing before him was Jim Morrison. The beard, the extra weight, the tired eyes. This wasn't the man who sang "Light My Fire." There were no leather pants, no charismatic gaze, no stage energy. The man standing before him looked like an ordinary person, a tired American lost on the streets of Paris, not a famous rock star. Morrison entered, slowly surveyed the studio, touched the old tape machines, approached the vintage microphone, felt the walls of the small room with his hands, and shook his head. When Muller asked him when his musicians would arrive, Morrison replied, no musicians would be coming. It would just be Morrison and a microphone. When Muller asked what kind of project this was, Morrison just smiled and said, "This isn't a project, it's a confession." That night, Morrison stayed in the studio for 4 hours, but didn't record anything. He just sat there, drank whiskey, and waited silently in front of the microphone. It was as if he was preparing himself, gathering his courage, getting ready to be real one last time. When Muller looked at Morrison's face, he saw fear, but he also saw peace. As if he was finally doing what he had to do, Morrison's hands were shaking. Muller noticed how his fingers tensed as he held the whiskey bottle. This man wasn't running from something, he was heading towards something, and that thing scared him, but also set him free. As the night progressed, Morrison drank more, grew quieter, stared more into the microphone. When midnight came, Morrison stood up and thanked Muller. He said he would be ready in 3 days and walked out the door. As Muller watched Morrison leave, he understood something. This man hadn't come here to die. He had come to record the truth. 3 days later, on the night Morrison returned, he was ready. Midnight came. He entered the studio, turned off the lights, and sat down in front of the microphone. Muller started the tape, and Morrison closed his eyes. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Morrison just sat there, breathing, waiting. His breaths were slow and deep, as if with each breath he was sinking deeper. In the dark studio, only the sound of Morrison's breathing and the faint hum of the tape machines could be heard. Muller waited in the control room, did not intervene, just watched. Then Morrison began to speak. He didn't sing, he spoke. He whispered. His voice was very low. Muller had to turn the microphone gain all the way up. For 7 minutes, Morrison repeated the same sentence in different tones, different rhythms. Muller was frozen in the control room. With each repetition, Morrison's voice became more fragile, more real, more painful. Sometimes it was a whisper, sometimes almost inaudible, sometimes rising slightly, but never shouting. Morrison was talking to himself, not to the world. In the 8th minute, Morrison stopped, opened his eyes, and told Muller that this had to be kept secret, that no one should hear it, but that the Doors should know, because Morrison was done. Rock stardom, the Lizard King persona, the stage, everything was over. When Muller looked at Morrison's face, he saw tears. Morrison was crying, but his voice didn't tremble, his hands were still. It was as if crying was now normal for him, something he did every day. Morrison told Muller to send these recordings to Los Angeles, for Ray Manzarek to receive them, for no one else to see them. When Muller asked why Ray, Morrison replied, "Because Ray would understand. Ray always understood. Ray was the man who knew Morrison from the beginning, and now he needed to see how Morrison ended." The next night, Morrison brought in a cellist. Her name was Dominique. She played in the Paris Opera Orchestra, and she didn't know Morrison. Muller had only told him that an American musician wanted to work with him, nothing else. When Dominique entered the studio, he saw Morrison and didn't recognize him. Morrison gave him no explanation, no instructions, just sat down in front of the microphone and began to speak. Dominique picked up his cello and followed Morrison's voice, matching his rhythm, matching his tone. The piece recorded that night lasted 12 minutes, and Morrison addressed his father, saying that the Admiral wanted a son, but that Morrison was a ghost, never a soldier, always an artist. Morrison's voice fluctuated, sometimes strong, sometimes almost inaudible. When talking about his father, Morrison's tone changed. There was no anger, only exhaustion, only surrender. When Dominique recounted this night in 2008, she cried because Morrison's voice was that of a dead man, alive yet already gone. They were recording a ghost. Dominique said she tried not to look at Morrison's face because every glance revealed such profound pain in his eyes that it was unbearable. Morrison spoke of his father, his childhood, of never being good enough. Every word echoed in Dominique's cello. Every sentence turned into music. That night, after the recording ended, Morrison thanked Dominique and said that art kills people, that it had killed him too. Dominique wanted to say something to Morrison, but the words wouldn't come. Morrison was already walking out the door, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, shoulders slumped, as if he would never return. A week later, Morrison called an oud player named Rashid to the studio. Rashid didn't know Morrison. He had only heard that an American singer wanted to work with him. When Rashid arrived at the studio, he saw Morrison and wondered if this man was famous, but he didn't ask. Morrison gave Rashid a single instruction: "Play, I'll talk." That night, Morrison spoke for 30 minutes to his father, his mother, Pamela, the members of the Doors, saying things he could never say to anyone's face. Rashid's oud wept beneath Morrison's voice, each note echoing Morrison's pain. Morrison spoke of his love for Pamela, the addiction they shared, how they destroyed each other. He thanked the Doors members, but also apologized to them, because he had disappointed them, worn them out, lost them. When the recording ended, Morrison's face was covered in tears, and when Rashid hugged him, Morrison whispered, "I'm leaving proof." When Rashid asked what proof, Morrison didn't answer, but 6 weeks later, when Rashid heard that Morrison had died, he understood. Morrison was leaving proof of his own disintegration, creating a voice recording that he knew he would no longer live. Rashid talked with Morrison for hours that night. They drank coffee, walked the streets of Paris, and Morrison told him his life story. Rashid noticed something in Morrison's eyes: acceptance. Morrison was no longer fighting, no longer resisting, just waiting for the end to come. When Rashid asked Morrison why he was giving up so early, Morrison replied, "I'm not giving up, I'm just finishing." Morrison came to the studio every night for 3 months and recorded 11 tracks. Some lasted 3 minutes, some 12. He didn't name any of them. He didn't give editing instructions. He didn't leave production notes. He just said, "Record it, save it, Send it to the doors. The content of the recordings was neither song nor traditional music. Morrison was reading poetry, reciting fragments of thought, addressing people, confessing his fears. In one track, Morrison spent 8 minutes just saying he was afraid, saying nothing else, just repeating the same confession of fear in different tones, different rhythms, different emotional intensities. In another piece, Morrison read something like a suicide note. No one knew if it was written years ago or that very day, but the weight of the words crushed everyone. Morrison spoke of being tired of life, of the stage being no different from a prison, of fans not truly knowing him. In several songs, Morrison addressed Ray, John, Robbie and Pamela directly, telling them things he could never say to their faces. Morrison's usual defensive sarcasm was gone, his macho attitude was gone, the Lizard King's arrogance was gone. There was only raw, vulnerable truth, and it was almost unbearable to hear. Morrison spoke to Ray about the band's future, saying they should continue, that the Doors could be better without Morrison. He spoke to John about his drumming technique, how he held the band together, how John brought him back when Morrison descended into chaos. He spoke to Robbie about his musical talent, admitting that Morrison's words meant nothing without Robbie's guitar. Muller said that in the last sessions, Morrison was barely functional. He would come to the studio, drink an entire bottle of wine within the first hour, and then record somewhere between consciousness and oblivion. His voice became increasingly incomprehensible. He mixed up words, sentences ended before they were finished, but he refused to stop. Morrison seemed to be racing against time, trying to say everything he needed to say before his body completely collapsed. The final session was on June 28, 1971, 5 days before Morrison's death. That night, Morrison recorded a 17-minute piece, mostly silence, punctuated only by occasional whispers and long, laboured breaths. Muller was frightened as he listened to Morrison's breathing, because each breath was harder than the last, as if Morrison's lungs were giving up on taking in air. When it was over, Morrison stood up, hugged Muller, and thanked him for allowing him to be honest. Morrison said to Muller, "You are my last witness. You are the last person who really saw me." Then he left the studio and never returned. Muller sent the tapes to Los Angeles on July 1st. Morrison died on July 3rd. The timing bothered Muller for the rest of his life, because Morrison seemed to have known he was going to die, as if he had timed the arrival of the tapes in Los Angeles and his own death. The package arrived at Elektra Records on July 22, 1971. While Ray Manzarek was trying to settle Morrison's estate, an assistant brought him a box from Paris. Inside were 7 reel-to-reel tapes and a note from Muller. Morrison had recorded these sessions and requested they be sent to Manzarek after his departure from Paris. The note had been written before Morrison died, lending everything an eerie quality, as if Morrison knew he would not be alive when the tapes arrived. Manzarek read the note 3 times, his hands shaking a little more each time. Seeing Morrison's handwriting, reading his words, understanding his requests devastated Manzarek, because it reminded him that Morrison was no longer there, that he would never come back. Manzarek immediately called Krieger and Densmore. They needed to listen to these together. None of them knew what to expect, but anything from Morrison was important, a treasure to be preserved, especially now that Morrison was dead. Late that night, they gathered at Elektra's Studio A. All 3 were exhausted, All three were still trying to cope with the shock of Morrison's death. Manzarek loaded the first tape into the machine, adjusted the buttons with trembling hands, and pressed play. The first sound from the speakers froze all three of them. It was Morrison's voice, but it was transformed, stripped of everything they knew. There was no power, no projection, no Lizard King attitude. There was just Morrison, the real Morrison, the naked Morrison. The first track was Morrison whispering poetry over a single cello line, and within 30 seconds, tears were streaming down John Densmore's face. Robbie Krieger would later tell an interviewer that listening to those tapes was like hearing a ghost, but a ghost recorded before the person died. The three listened silently. No one spoke. No one moved. With each track, the room grew heavier, the air thicker. Morrison's voice came from the speakers, but it was as if he was there, in the room with them. Manzarek buried his head in his hands during the part where Morrison addressed his father. Krieger closed his eyes during the part where Morrison spoke of his love for Pamela. Densmore began to cry during the part where Morrison said goodbye to the Doors. They listened to all 7 reels, which took about 4 hours, and in the end, none of them could speak. There was only silence in the studio, a heavy, suffocating silence. The tapes were not merely experimental or non-commercial. They were documents of Morrison's psychological breakdown, an audio suicide note spread across multiple recordings. Releasing them would have been like putting Morrison's private therapy sessions on vinyl and selling them to fans, exploitative, wrong, and felt like a violation of whatever dignity Morrison had left. Manzarek made the decision that night. These tapes would never be released. They would be locked in the Electra vault, archived but not destroyed, preserved but never heard. Krieger and Densmore agreed immediately. Morrison had recorded them in a state of complete vulnerability, probably not even considering them for public consumption, and releasing them would betray everything their friendship stood for. The Doors had spent years protecting Morrison from himself, making excuses for him when he was too drunk to perform, bailing him out of jail, managing his chaos. They weren't going to stop protecting him just because he was dead. Now they owed him more protection than ever, and those tapes would remain locked away forever. When the three of them left the studio that night, none of them looked back. None of them ever spoke of the tapes again. The Paris recordings remain one of rock music's great mysteries. The tapes exist, but will never be heard. The final statement from a legend deemed too dark, too honest, too human for public consumption. When Ray Manzarek was asked one last time before his death in 2013, his answer was definitive. Those tapes were Morrison's most raw, most frightened, most human state, and precisely for that reason, they had to remain private. The world took the Lizard King, the version Morrison chose to show. The version on those tapes was only for them, for the people who loved him, and it will stay that way. Perhaps some secrets should remain buried. Perhaps this is the only way legends survive. Did Morrison die in Paris or in that studio? No one knows. But one thing is certain. On those tapes, Morrison was real for the last time. He was himself for the last time. He was just Jim, not the Lizard King. And perhaps that is enough.